Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Miguel Meira. I'm the Dean of Arts and Humanities here at the University of Southampton, and I'd like to offer my very warm welcome to the annual Montefiore Lecture in honour of Claude Montefiore. Claude Montefiore was a major theologian and founding leader within the movement of liberal Judaism in the UK. He helped to found the Jewish Religious Union in 1902 and served as president of the World Union for Progressive Judaism from 1926 until his death in 1938. He was a noted philanthropist, but also a great scholar. He was a pioneer of interfaith dialogue and produced scholarship in the fields of ancient Jewish history and theology and its relationship with Christianity. He published particularly on the relationship between Judaism and the New Testament, famously writing some of the first Jewish commentaries on the Synoptic Gospels in English. Some of the most notable works include Judaism and St. Paul in 1914, a 2-volume commentary on the Synoptic Gospels in 1927, and Rabbinic Literature and Gospel Teachings in 1930. He was also the president of what was then University College Southampton from 1913 to 1934. The Montefiore Lecture was established in his honour in the 1950s, and it's the oldest established public lecture in the university calendar. Indeed, it was attending a Montefiore lecture that prompted James Parkes to donate his library to Southampton in 1964, and which led to the establishment of the Parkes Institute for the study of Jewish and non-Jewish relations. The Parkes Institute today is a community of scholars, archivists, librarians, students and fellows whose expertise and interests spans history, modern languages, music, archaeology, English studies and film. And the Hartley Library is home to the wonderful holdings of the Parkes Library and Jewish Archive collections, and also the books on Judaism and Jewish-Christian relations from Montefiore's collections. I know many of you know that collection well, but if you haven't had a chance to have a look at his to deliver this year's Montefiore Lecture. Hindy Najman is the Oriel and Lang Professor of the Interpretation of Holy Scripture and Fellow at Oriel College, Oxford, where she's also Director and Founder of the Centre for the Study of the Bible. She's a member of the Faculty of Theology and Religion, Asian and Middle Eastern Studies, and a member of the Faculty of Classics, and a member of the Oxford Centre for Hebrew and Jewish Studies. And for her lecture this evening, Professor Najman will be drawing on her most recent monograph, Scriptural Vitality, Rethinking Philology and Hermeneutics. So please welcome Hindy Najman. Thank you.
Many thanks to Dean Miguel Meira. Thank you to Sammy Everett, to James Jordan. A special thanks to 2 very dear friends, Helen Sperling, who is online, who initiated this process a few years ago, and to Sarah Pierce. I'm so honored and delighted to be here, and especially to speak to the Parkes Institute. I feel that the work that I'm able to do today and that I did in my book is only possible because of institutions like the Parkes Institute, a very, very bold and courageous vision for the conversation between Judaism and other religions, and also the presence of Jewish history here, I think, is an extraordinary presence, and it's a strong presence that the rest of the universities in this country could learn something from. I mean, just spending time here today and speaking both to Sarah and to Helen, as well as to your colleagues here, it's a very, very important contribution now, perhaps more than ever, to think hard about how to spread understanding and tolerance and conversation so we can learn from one another and think together. So I'm really very inspired to share my book with you, and I hope it's a good journey. When you send books off, to land, you send them out to the world and you don't know what exactly will come of them. So I'm very excited to hear your thoughts and your reflections. The book came out with Oxford University Press about 9 months ago. And both Sarah and Helen had thought it would be good to share the book with you and to talk about the larger implications for what it is that I'm doing. I know I speak here to historians, to scholars of literature, and to scholars of music. And my hope is that that this is a book that will speak not just from the position of antiquity, but also it reflects critically on Wissenschaft des Judentums, on the history of Jewish studies. Okay. A little word about my book. I got a grant and it's open access. So it would be nice for OUP if you bought it, but you don't have to. And if you like the book, you can just go to the OUP site and it's available, which has been really wonderful for students and colleagues around the world. So I'm very proud of that. Texts don't grow from point A to point B. Rather, there's a larger life, what I've called vitality. Drawing on the work of the scholar of mysticism and really the founder of Jewish studies at the Hebrew University, Gershom Scholem, texts grow in time and across time in the hands of tradents, interpreters, scribes, and interpretative communities. This is a complicated corrective that I'm offering this evening, where redactional criticism and textual criticism go hand in hand. One of the central themes of my book is the importance of reconsidering the Hellenistic period as one of the most important and formative periods for the history of Judaism, as a period of compositional reworking and integration of a variety of traditions. And Sami in particular will think of the Abbasid period as a golden age. And I want to say that the Hellenistic period was also a golden age, but interestingly suppressed or even forgotten. I employ this language then of vitality, and I intend to signal by the word vitality a transformative and life-giving dynamic to a Judaism that continued to configure itself and its texts over time in the face of great loss and under the threat of destruction. This dynamic and resilient nature is exemplified in a whole host of texts across what's often called the Second Temple period, a period which encompasses both the Persian and Hellenistic, or for classicists in the room, the classical and Hellenistic periods. But this also, as I mentioned already in my introductory words, it has profound implications for the historiography of Judaism, or Wissenschaft des Judentums, as it extends well into late antiquity, medieval times, and even today. My claim runs counter to the long standard idea that Second Temple Judaism is Spät Judentum, or late Judaism. This term has been imperfectly replaced by Früh Judentum, early Judaism. But I want to argue that the underlying attitude expressed by these terms is still detectable, lateness, and the prolific productivity of the Second Temple period has not been adequately acknowledged for the impact and importance for the history of Judaism. Part of it is also this project comes out of the findings of the Jewish community amongst Oxyrhynchus papyri, amongst the Dead Sea Scrolls, and more broadly, the integration of the kind of work that Helen Sperling and Sarah Pierce do, the broader Greek and Latin world of Judaism, of Jewish communities. It's okay. I argue against some lines of current thinking in the field of ancient Judaism and biblical studies. Great, thank you. Problematizing the search for the originary moment, and I'm gonna touch on all these 4 dimensions across the talk. Okay. I argue that the reconstruction, so this first point, I argue that the reconstruction of an original archetype is not the only or even the best way to study the history of the development of a text. I problematize the search then for the original moment because it can obscure the compositional history of a work that is not singular or pluriform. This is relevant for all sorts of texts and musical compositions as well, of course, right? Psalms, Jeremiah, Exodus, Tabernacles, Parak Shirah, for those of you that work on mystical traditions, the Haggadah, the Kaddish, and many more. I express a sharp critique of the need to reconstruct something prior to or original, as if the pretext or the prior text redeems or gives us privileged information about the first or original moment of that text. That is, privileging of an oral or even an imaginary ur-text does not on its own help us understand the life and breadth of tradition. I propose instead that we turn our gaze to consider the growth and development of textual traditions as part of the very fabric and essence of a textual tradition under critical evaluation. So each textual tradition then, Psalms, Esther, Isaiah, is distinctive, but each textual tradition shares a plurality and a dynamic which is life-giving. Thus, compositional history, which is a thing that many biblicists speak about, is not about finding tensions or ruptures in the text. If you know anything about biblical studies, you'll know about standing up and cutting the text up into pieces with the scissors. But rather, and this is not what I'm advocating for by compositional history, I would rather reconstruct the conversation of compositional practice over decades and centuries. So texts, ancient and modern, have complex histories and interactions within traditions, as they are embedded nevertheless in a single identifiable work. I've advocated then for a pluriform model of textuality as an alternative framework to the monoform. That is, and just a gloss on that, texts are not created in a singular manner, but rather they are part of a larger interpretative, commenting, and internal process of critique, which generates variation, change, and reformulation, albeit in the context of transmission. Before I go on to the third point, I want to say that this really comes out of many decades of conversations with classicists and medievalists. And because it's not enough really to stand in our own disciplines, I feel, because it becomes very insular. But we need a critique that stands outside of theology or outside history or outside classics, and to create a new, and this is another reason why the humanities unit here is so inspiring. And it's a very, I think, important way to move forward and to think across disciplines in conversation with one another without giving up what's distinctive about each of our disciplines. Pluriformity is not only an account then of the extant forms of the text, but it's a characterization of how textual traditions originate and transform. Furthermore, variation can express development of scribal thought processes and the integration of textual traditions. In studying the tension then between what I want to call regulation and production, we can see how pluriformity works, but also what's at stake in that moment. And I'm thinking about how the moment of new pluriformity arises in tandem with emerging fixity. Rewriting then can perhaps be understood as an integration of the monoform and the polyform. There's ongoing tension between regulation and production. Reading practices are then about understanding the interrelational dimensions of a work, not as a work only of the past, but rather one that continually revitalizes itself through internal conversations as a read and interpreted text. To understand the construction of the text is to understand its own poesis within each iteration and across its pluriform manifestations. And before I reflect a little bit on authorial practices, this is the great scroll of Isaiah. It's enormous. There's actually a big exhibition going on right now at the Israel Museum on this exhibit. But part of what you've done, and this is a slide from a colleague of mine, Marcello Fidencio, who's used AI in order to discern different spaces that scribes left and different filling in. This is a text that was written across a century. So we can see scribes think. And we can think with them as they supplement, delete, expand. I mean, those of you that know Horace's Ars Poetica, all of the things that Horace talks about that scribes do and that writers do is also being done by Jewish scribes in the Hellenistic period. So texts are alive and responsive to correction, of course, also to error. People often say, Hindy, you don't mention error. It's less interesting to me, though of course there are errors, but I'm interested in the pluses and the minuses that are deliberate as a tradition is developed and thought about more. You see? Pretty cool, right? Okay. I'll just go back one more time so you can see them. This is kind of some of the work that we're doing now on the scrolls. if there's time later, we can go back and I can actually read some of that text with you and we can talk specifically what's happening in some of those pluses. Okay, another ongoing dimension of my research, which actually reaches back to my very first book in 2003, is about author function and authorizing practices. It's really a fundamental critique about authenticity. What constitutes an authentic work is an important part of the argument of my book, but also ongoing research. There's actually a research cluster now in Zurich that we're working on with classicists and scholars of Jewish studies. Here, I challenge forgery. I have challenged forgery as a category that reifies what is authentic and pristine and original versus what is part of a growing organism. That is, in addition to resisting the search for an original, a singular original, and deprecating whatever is not part of that original moment, I'm also not looking for what is or is not authentic with respect to forgery. I want to understand how traditions grow, and as they grow, how they attach to existing collections or works, but also associating with an earlier protagonist as an authoritative figure. So it's not Moses, but it's called Mosaic. It's not, Jeremianic, but it's nevertheless associated with the figure of Jeremiah. To this end, I've played a little bit with the notion of fan fiction, but really collaborative writing. And here Foucault and Nietzsche have been enormously important for me. Foucault talks a little bit about the Bourbaki, this group of mathematicians who wrote collectively. For Nietzsche, I talk a little bit about this in the book, The Homeric Question. But I'm really thinking about the way in which we can develop figures into precursors for subsequent writing and innovative imagination. And this notion of precursors comes from Borges's Kafka and his precursors, and T.S. Eliot has also thought about this. Of course, all of this is connected to the search not only for the earliest text, but also for the original author. Our traditions should not be associated with single figures any more than they are produced in a singular manner and transmitted in a monoform. So I already mentioned the Isaiah scroll, and I want to spend a little bit of time now to talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls, because this is part of my own radical rethinking of the field. I was trained in the early 1990s in Harvard, and it was the early days of absorbing the information about the Dead Sea Scrolls into the field, which has been a very, very slow process because we're very, very resistant to rewriting our histories and rewriting our narratives. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that across the next 10 minutes or so. But including and incorporating the Dead Sea Scrolls into a larger discourse of ancient Judaism and biblical studies into Jewish studies, I believe is essential in understanding the development of Jewish thought and philosophy, as well as material philology. By way of identifying the community from Qumran, the location where these scrolls were found in 11 caves, which self-identifies as a group called the Yachad, which just really means togetherness, being unified, I present an explicit challenge against the first and even second generation of scholars that characterize the Dead Sea Scrolls as sectarian. An overemphasis on particular so-called sectarian categories serves to isolate and interrupt or disturb the deep and continuous connections between the world of ancient Judaism and the Greco-Roman world and beyond, and especially the rabbinic collections. These challenges that I'm offering are meant to create space for a vitality which exhibits new innovative possibility. Judaism is framed by a past and a future which are textual, especially, but not only, scriptural. The scriptures themselves retrospectively create the pattern for the shaping of law, the shaping of interpretation, and new conceptual innovation that is created through convergence of cultures in the Hellenistic period. It's also the case that traditions of scripture carry with them a rich past of text, tradition, and cultural convergence, earlier periods of the Babylonian and the Persian period, as well as this later period of Hellenism. The scriptures I discuss here are more expansive and flexible. So while the emergence of canon as such is a later development, in this period, we're seeing scripture and even canon information. So this is a slide of the Great Psalm Scroll, which you would recognize many of the Psalms from the Psalter, but there are also many Psalms that we've never seen before, which look, smell, taste just like Psalms, but they're other creations. Are they texts that were lost? Are they new scriptural productions, poems that are created in the late Hellenistic period and included in an ever-expanding Psalter? Here, I'm sorry that the light's not great, but this is a 4Q70 from Jeremiah. And you see, like we saw with the Isaiah scroll, the writing, the correction, the scribe added in on the side. Jeremiah, if you don't know, Jeremiah is an extraordinary example of textual plurality across different versions in the Greek and in the Hebrew. So it's a text like an accordion. It grows and it contracts across different versions of its transmission and its copying. So it's not about inaccurate or accurate copying. It's about the growing with every, I'm looking at your dean, so I'm thinking about musical language of performance, which was actually my first discipline. That's a different conversation. But the way each performance, in some sense, each writing, each reading changes. It changes the text. It doesn't mean that we don't have Jeremiah or that we don't have Isaiah. It actually means we have it, and we have it in a very specific new growing context. It's about the life and not the death of the very tradition, insofar as it's transmitted. Okay. So in my book, I articulate paths that were not taken for thinking about biblical studies and interpretation, and for examining these emerging scriptures and their persistent vitality. In so doing, I want to explore both the philosophical and literary discussions and incorporate new, innovative materials and textual findings. Texts from Jewish antiquity, whether they're apocryphal or pseudepigraphic, or the Dead Sea Scrolls, or the Hebrew Bible itself, are layered with history, internal as well as external, in conversation and undergoing revision. Entangled histories and hermeneutics are embedded within and beyond these texts. Reception of earlier traditions, interpretation and updating of such traditions, as well as the inclusion of new cultural insight and philological innovation through borrowing, influence, and poetic creativity, all part of the vitality of which I speak. This is an approach then that, as I mentioned earlier, that doesn't consider Hellenism as a lesser period, which is called derivative, or it's the period of an artificial development of Hebrew, or it's a remnant of concepts and beliefs from ancient Israelite religion. These are all the things that are said and continue to be said in scholarship. Rather, my focus are the ways in which scribes, priests, and scholars, and artists, we know now about artists in the Hellenistic and late antique period, and we're going to see some synagogal mosaics in a few minutes, which render the inherited traditions comprehensible. It's important then to understand that the Hellenistic period is a kind of gateway to new growth and development. We can no doubt already see signs of this development in the Persian period, such as Nehemiah 8:8. As they returned from the exile, they read from the scroll of the teaching of God, translating it and giving it sense. So they understood the reading. Vayikru v'sefer v'torat Elohim v'farash v'som seichel v'yavinu b'mikra. Here in the text, the scribes and the priests are said to render comprehensible what is read from the scriptures to the community. But one can also see it as a late Hellenistic development in a psalm like Psalm 119, which is overflowing with discussion of insight and wisdom and the understanding of the law. Here in this passage, we see an ethic of study to the text for insight and guidance. In any event, practices of reading for comprehension and the dissemination of knowledge of tradition and scriptures in the Hellenistic period are inextricably linked to practices of reading and of performance, and of those scriptural traditions and the interpretations as well, be they commentary, translations, new liturgies, or new rituals, which build upon and instantiate old rituals. And these are all the kinds of texts and objects that we find already in the Hellenistic period. Reading practices thus perform and exemplify the inheritance of earlier textual traditions through explication and interpretation of those texts by a dynamic enlivenment of those traditions in the context of history and culture, and by the communities and writers who, to invoke Yaus, we could call them first readers, if you will. All of these aspects constitute reading, editing, and refinement, interpretation and expansion, transmission and reception. To read, then, is to perform and to change, but it is also to repeat and to authorize. Reading then is part of a larger dynamic that is at once oral and written, past and present, expansive and refining. And to inhabit a new text is to create a new context for reading and for thinking. Reading then can signify the multiple layers of both reading by new readers and by rereading an already practiced text. Reading in antiquity then can be about liturgy, study, and the establishment of new community. Textual traditions are about reading the past, but not to the exclusion of the present. These texts also participate in the incorporation of new insights from their own present, and these new insights model innovative ways of thinking about their present. Innovations of this kind are of particular importance because of how they exemplify cultural exchange. This is an example of our earliest Hebrew commentary. One might suggest that you already see signs of commentary or rereading or explication embedded within the Hebrew Bible, and we see it in Daniel's reading of Jeremiah or Psalm's reading of earlier narratives. But this is an explicit commentary, which was very exciting for people. And you see the break in between. And those of you that read Hebrew, 4 lines down, Pishro al, which means its interpretation is about. And again, with each lemma, Pishro al, and then it's a few quotations from Habakkuk, which is one of the book of the 12 prophets, the minor prophets, and then it explains it. It articulates it, it activates it, it makes it meaningful and present to the community today. A little factoid, which is really exciting about this text, and I'll go back to the formal part of the lecture, but we have this size of a text from Habakkuk at Qumran, but we have passages all over this text. So we use the commentary or the interpretative text to recover our earliest examples of a Hebrew text. Which, by the way, is also pluriform, even in its citation. Some of the citations in Pesach Habakkuk are aligned much more with the Greek tradition that we have in the Septuagint, and others align with what we come to call the Masoretic text. The focus on vitality is part of a larger commitment then to rethink the direction of textual work for the study of the ancient world. Instead of reconstructing the archetype as the originary moment, I focus on a forward-moving gesture that considers convergence between Hebrew and Greek. And to study vitality then within antiquity is to practice a philology that participates in new composition, expansion, and the creation of new texts. This is true about the Appendix Virgiliana as a continuation of Virgil's work, the Homeric hymns as a continuation of the Iliad and the Odyssey. So too, we can draw analogies then to the Mosaic and the Jeremianic, to the didactic and the sapiential, and of course, liturgical poetic collections. So while forward-looking aspects of textual innovation, rewriting, and rereading are accepted in classics, in the biblical scholarly tradition, this approach is less common, and it has a great deal to do with canonical strictures and impositions on biblical studies. And I want to argue that the ongoing growth and expansion of biblical traditions are not a byproduct of studying a text, but rather it's what stains the life of textual tradition through interpretative communities. Likewise, as languages come into contact with other languages, as they are both spoken and written, they dynamically change and emerge over time. These shifts in language are also entwined with the performance of new reading, and these various dynamics are the life and breath of a tradition that's been resilient and consistent. Innovation does not happen then at the cost of continuing existing traditions or texts, but it allows them to persist in new ways. And this alternative of a forward-moving philology embraces the pluriformity of texts and diverse manuscript traditions and textual versions over and against a uniformed archetype, which is presupposed as rupture and replacement as a one-time occurrence. And I just want to pause for a second here and talk about, just to have you reflect on the Septuagint, the Greek translation, which we have some Greek manuscripts in Qumran, but not a lot, and of course the tradition of the Greek translation. So vitality for me is also across linguistic registers. Okay. The term vitality is thereby an essential part of this critique of the history of scholarship, Protestant Bible theology, as well as historicism, and also a proposal that ancient Judaism should be studied as a forward-moving organism, not as a corpse to dissect. Through various manifestations of creativity and innovation, through late antiquity and manuscripts, and this is going to be a little bit of fun. So we have scrolls. And here I'm going to show you some mosaics. This is from En-Gedi, from the 4th century. Chukok. These are some of the newest mosaics that have just been uncovered in the 5th and 6th century CE. Hamat Taberia. And here you see many images. But those of you that came to see an iconic Judaism, you went to the wrong lecture. Judaism is full of images and full of color and full of poetic imagination in the form of art and in the form of text and in the form of philosophy. This is really interesting to me. A new project I'm working on is about ongoing priestly discourse. This is a 5th to 6th century mosaic CE from Tiberius. You have the menorah, you have incense shovels. We found here and also in Sepphoris incense shovels with signs of incense on them. So incense continued, but the memory of temple continued as an active memory across manuscripts as well as mosaics and synagogal performance. There's more to say about this if you want to, but I'll leave it alone for now. This is Sepphoris, as well as ritual baths, the mikveh. Rituals as early we find phylacteries, tefillin, as early as the Second Temple. It's very important to say, and Jonathan Adler, those of you that are familiar with his name, has argued that it's completely different because the traditions of the phylacteries are different. There's pluriformity in the practice of what texts are included in phylacteries, possibly even how they're worn and how they're preserved. Does this surprise us? Does it mean that this is sectarian phylacteries versus normative phylacteries? And I would say this is about the history of the development and thinking about this world. And I want to go a little bit broader with you, and I want to think about magic bowls. These magic bowls have been studied by a number of scholars, notably Gidi Boak and many others. But I want to say here also we see Judaism come to life in conversation with pagan traditions and Christian traditions. They're written they're apotropaic bowls. They have spells. They're asked to protect women, children, and those of you they after they're written in these poems, and often they're filled with scriptural citation or miscitation. They're playing in a pluriform way with texts. They're flipped over in the front of the house to kind of capture the demons and keep them out of your house. And a little bit more. This is the earliest. This is constantly redated. This slide says 600 BC. Some of my colleagues who've worked on it say it's a little bit later. The most important thing about it, even if it's a century later, it is the earliest Hebrew text that we have. But the second oldest body of texts are from the Dead Sea Scrolls, because we don't have Hebrew texts from the period. They're much, much later. But this is priestly blessing. May God bless you and keep you. Yivarecha Adonai v'yishmerecha, which continues to be used in both the Jewish and in the Christian liturgical traditions. It's a silver amulet, which was tiny and rolled up like one on a necklace, and they unrolled it. And it's, yeah. I'll just let you look at this a little bit while I continue. Judaism has been, throughout its history, alive and dynamic to its past, its future, and its present. One cannot draw a singular one-dimensional line from text to translation, not from the Persian period to the Hellenistic period. The interactions across cultural and chronological lines are complex and interrelated. Texts grow across chronological, cultural, and linguistic borders between the biblical and the extra-biblical, between the Hebrew and Greek, and they demonstrate ongoing resilience. My book then celebrates these moments of entanglement and innovative transformations of Judaism in conversation with surrounding culture. This is not an argument for influence or direct borrowing or imposition of the Greek onto the Hebrew. Rather, I prefer here to think about convergences. Moments of convergence between texts allow us to see signs of life, continuity, breath, and memory within new manuscripts of pre-existing texts and in the receptions of those texts. The collection of biblical traditions then in the Hellenistic period is not stable, despite repeated references to the law and the prophets. There's dramatic growth of textual traditions well within and beyond the Hebrew Bible. And there are also texts that rework earlier biblical narratives as new performances. Other texts create new liturgies, which build and develop on different categories, previous prayers, collections, and rituals. And still others are legal texts in character and in form, which expand upon early Jewish law, such as Jubilees, rule texts for Qumran, or the Temple Scroll. As I mentioned in my introductory section, I don't want to reconstruct historical layers of the text, nor to reconstruct its earlier parts. History and composition are the focus. However, the emphasis on biblical traditions as unreadable or needing to be reconstructed into pretexts does not attend to a complex literary history, which is part of reading within and beyond biblical traditions. Our texts from biblical and Jewish antiquity have embedded compositional histories that are left transparently at the surface for all of us to see and engage in a variety of ways. No attempt on the part of biblical or extra-biblical authors or editors is made to erase the complexity of composite works. Readers are challenged by the text to make sense of contradiction in a way that forces them to inherit multiple traditions. And so to read these texts, even today, is also to participate in the history of the text, because one must participate in a practice of exegesis as a way of preserving the inconsistencies, the gaps, and the interruptions in the narrative. In sum, these inconsistencies are part of the artistry of the text and inherent to their compositional practices. The overarching goal then is to contribute to understanding the whole of a literary work and thus pave the way to a new hermeneutic for reading biblical narratives. Philology then needs to go hand in hand with reading, writing, and editing. And I mean by these terms various practices connected to the emergence of new text, nothing less than the history of interpretation. To adapt a line from Immanuel Kant, historical linguistics without a history of interpretation is empty. History of interpretation without historical linguistics is blind. So the history of interpretation without historical linguistics is blind because it cannot tell what it has before it, what the linguistic uses and abuses are. But philology without the history of interpretation is empty because it is unclear what the significance of linguistic use or abuses. That is, unless philology, the study of language or the love of language, is situated within an account of what readers, writers, and editors are doing, of what they're trying to withstand, and of how they are trying to insist on the resistance and the persistence of their language and culture. The 20th century Hungarian German literary critic and philologist Peter Szanyi focused on the way a work develops over time and considers the concept of a poetic process. He was not interested in a single originary moment, but he was concerned with ongoing and ever continuous productivity of a work with respect to its history, philology, and production. He understood the work of the scholar as an intervening reader who continues to produce the text through their own reading. Szanyi's conception of philology was also rooted in the future and in the past, but he conceptualized philology in light of the presence or collection of a work. This work is complex and situated within time. Reading for Szanyi then is about understanding the interrelational dimensions of a work, but not only a work of the past, but rather one that is life-giving to itself through internal conversation and its afterlife as a read and interpreted text. Whereas intertextuality, especially drawing from Kristeva, has been taken in biblical studies as a lens through which to examine a text's indebtedness or its reception, Szanyi's framework allows us more deeply to reconsider the text as internally complex and as giving rise to complex interaction. Philosophically, much of Szanyi's work was devoted to erkenntnis, to understanding, and to bridging a past to the future through practices of reading. For Szanyi, works are rendered then comprehensible and historically contextualized. I turned to Szanyi because I believe that Szanyi, although he's really not read in the world of biblical studies, to offer an intervention into current developments in biblical hermeneutics. Philology then needs to be grounded philosophically and also literarily, so one doesn't lose sight of the text in its largest form. And once we understand what it was that Szanyi means by a work, in history and its poetic whole, we can begin to understand what it means to speak of vitality of the text. To mention, Sandi wrote on Hölderlin and Celan, not on biblical texts. And he's very, very much a product, for those of you that know a little bit about him, of the Holocaust. And he, shortly after his own inaugural, he took his own life. So this was a very urgent conversation for Peter Sandi. In the 1960s, for Sandi, as well as for Gershom Scholem or Walter Benjamin. For Sandi, in his inaugural, the hope of which he spoke, breaking the silence about not speaking about the Holocaust and Nazification in the academy, it was urgent for reasons of destruction and paralysis in the 1960s, as he wrote about Walter Benjamin. He said, Benjamin's new conception of history is rooted in the dialectic of a future and a past messianic expectation and remembrance. Adorno might have been right at the time when he said that it would be barbaric to write poetry after Auschwitz. But that was immediately after the rupture of the Holocaust. Not only did Adorno come to see that non-barbaric poetry was still possible, but his statement served as a challenge to poetry, which needed to find new forms or new ways of using old forms. We still live with this challenge more than a half a century later. Sandi struggled with these questions, but he did so with a different path. Peter Sandi's conception of philology was also rooted in the past, but he did so in the present of a collection or a work. This work is complex and situated within time. So Sandi perhaps is a partner for me, a conversation partner for understanding practices of reading, his understanding about an interrelational dimension of a work, not only of the past, but one that is life-giving. And if we're to understand the authority of Scripture, and I'm just reflecting a little bit on this quote here, and other religiously privileged corpora, we must seek to understand the generative vitality of these texts. And this will require us to cross the boundaries between the canonical or scriptural texts themselves and the marginal text to which they inevitably gave rise. And this is precisely to what Sandi is referring to when he signals a constant or perpetual confronting of a text through understanding. What then do we mean by hermeneutics? I contend that it's not the tendency to read through a model of intertextuality, and instead I want to offer a different answer. I want to continue to push back on the impulse then to reduce the core of a text or a tradition to its originary moment. And here the impulse to get at the dissected parts of a collection or to unread it is to work against understanding. To atomize our text and to try to find the early or the original is not productive with respect to practices of perpetuating the dimensions of philology that we want to think about, poetic processes. Scripture then rereads itself within the text, and I have many examples throughout my work, and here I'm giving a broader overview, and we can talk in the Q&A if you want about specific examples of what this looks like. But this rereading goes beyond itself. That is, the text takes it into the afterlife of the text through its embeddedness in later writers and through the history of scholarship, with new additions, the discovery of new fragments, the engagements with new discourses of location, heavenly, earthly, liminal, and cosmic. What's important to this discussion with respect to philology is hermeneutics, that is, the study of language as interpretation, is that the practices of philology can be used to trace the lines of composition and emerging new readings in scholarly, poetic, philosophical, or theological engagements. Our responsibilities as scholars are urgent and sensitive. In our times, the work of the philologist must be as mindful of the future as we are of the past. The goal then is not to focus on what is missing from our discipline, but rather to highlight and integrate the contributions of literature and imagination from this ancient period of Hellenism. While scholarship already recognized the contribution of the scrolls to understanding the history of interpretation, it absolutely has not taken on board the larger implications for transforming the way Judaism was understood and characterized in the Hellenistic period. The scrolls, the Dead Sea Scrolls, attest to a dramatic transformation of textuality and practices of reading. Increasingly, the critical questions are less about how to reconstruct the earliest layers then, and instead about charting growth. This intense reopening of the field to new literary criticism in the 1980s and 1970s and 1980s brought about new enthusiasm about the interpretive dimensions of the Hebrew Bible in formation. It also demonstrated that biblical texts are alive to their production, even at the level of internal composition and transcription, as a kind of study and performance, respectively. I bring to this book, and hopefully to you this evening, a kind of optimism, but also a recognition of the need for extensive correction. We must integrate the ways in which ancients have been able to read and accommodate existing narratives. If the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament is read as superseded, it will only be studied retrospectively with a dogmatic burial. If the Dead Sea Scrolls are rendered sectarian and marginal to the history of the development of Judaism, their contribution to the dynamic voices of Hebrew hermeneutics and Jewish philosophy will be silenced. If Philo of Alexandria is to be read as Philo Christianus, as Tertullian and others read him, he will never have a voice or contribute to the history of Judaism. My claim is that Second Temple period is then a period of radical innovation with deep and complex engagement across other religious traditions. I'm going to move a little bit forward just because of the time. And part of what just a few more examples of a hewn stone that was recently found in a synagogue in the 1st century BCE, which surprised everyone, which showed signs of prayer and of reflection. This is one of a series of findings. I'm gonna pause on the stone for a moment. New findings about composition and textual revision can be traced through the Dead Sea Scrolls, as well as the vital and dynamic information we're also able to gather up from the Cairo Geniza. The scrolls in particular demand that we rethink this challenge of a single archetype. And I want to think about the kind of pluriformity that is exemplified in some of these mystical texts, the Hechalot, as well as Sefer Yetzirah, which is a great example how there was not just a singular version out of which any variation or corruption emerged. And in earlier traditions, we've also come to understand that pluriformity is a way of life and breath of a text, not its indecision or lack of earliest layers. Pluriformity challenges us not to think in terms of a fixed text, but rather in terms of an identity or a corpus. So these various examples, non-scriptural examples, the Magdala stone, which showed us that in synagogues already, there were hewn stones, and Rina Talgam has argued they read as a podium from these stones, even while the Second Temple is still standing, as well as these mystical traditions about which I spoke. And here are some of the additions. Okay, some concluding reflections. To understand the ever-flowing waters of hermeneutics, wisdom, practices of commentary and reading, and interpretative motifs that continue to be shared across centuries of reading communities is to understand what I have called forward-moving philology. We see in this dynamic, and this is from the cover of my book, and I chose Kandinsky's Black Lines, and I want to use this as a way of closing my talk this evening. We see in this dynamic the poetry and philosophy of Jewish antiquity. It is the participation in culture and contribution in the form of dramatic innovation that I want to draw to the forefront of research and investigation. And it's what I have suggested in my book perfectly is captured in Kandinsky's Black Lines. Thank you.
Thank you, Hindy, for that wonderful animation of scriptural vitality. I think you've shown us that texts can be alive and entangled in lots of fantastic ways. So thank you. I'm sure we've got some questions in the room and online. So maybe we could start in the room if anyone has any questions.
You mentioned that sometimes we look at precursors, mentioned Moses and Mosaic, and so which is wonderful to hear, and you're looking at that way. You mentioned T.S. Eliot in that context. Could you develop that slightly? So I'm not sure which part of T.S. Eliot.
So there's an essay where he also talked, like Borges does, about precursors that are used. So I'll explain the concept, right? So if you read the example that I develop most in my own work is if you read Philo's depiction of Moses, Philo of Alexandria, you go back and Moses is a different figure. Or if you read Second Esdras, Ezra becomes a different figure in the hands of Second Esdras when you go back and read Ezra Nehemiah. So the notion of reading later figures, later writers that internalize or integrate a particular figure, which is not historically that figure, forces us to read or reread or animate a figure from the past. I've particularly developed the emergence of Moses in that way. And actually just earlier today, I was lecturing about what Solomon becomes if you think about the collection that comes to be associated with him. So the category of wisdom associated with Solomon, who gets a double portion, or in some traditions, a fourfold portion of wisdom, then generates Song of Songs and Proverbs. But his legacy continues well beyond himself. And I want to suggest, in addition to texts themselves growing through interpretation and expansion, the figures themselves grow over time, and they appropriate or absorb certain features. I think can I give you one funny example, and then which is about Abraham. So Abraham is said to live in according with much later law. I mean, much later law, like the specific laws about the challenge if it's a holiday that's juxtaposed to a Sabbath. Can you prepare on the holiday, on a Friday, for Sabbath? And it would seem no, but you can. And there's a legal loophole that's created. And the rabbi said, not only did Abraham keep the laws, but he kept even Eruv Tavshilin is the term in rabbinic language. Because the sense that the tradition as it grows with Abraham, avot kimu mitzvot, that the patriarchs kept the law because Abraham, as a perfect rabbinical Jew, becomes a precursor for how to understand Abraham's perfection. And I guess I liken that, it's a jump, it's a leap that I took, but I likened the growth of figures to the growth of text as they continue to be interpreted and grow. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We have a hand online, so let's go there next. That's Helen.
Yes, thank you very much. Hindy, that was absolutely wonderful lecture. Thank you so much for that. And I think the argument for the vitality and just life of these traditions is actually just a really important way of demonstrating the relevance of our disciplines, actually. So thank you so much for that. I have a number of questions. I'll just stick with one for now. My first question is, you make this absolutely brilliant case for the sort of golden age of the Second Temple period. And then towards the end of your talk, you showed the text from the Hekkelot and Sefer Yetzirah. And I'm just wondering how you see the relationship between that Second Temple period and the rabbinic period. Is it, I would view it as continued vitality, but do you think there is something distinctive about the Second Temple period, and how does that relate to the rabbinic period?
That's a very fair question. Yes, so I'm smiling because my colleagues who are rabbinicists really want me to take this much further and much deeper into Muli Vidas and Yishai Rosenzweig, really to think with them about later rabbinic texts. I'm going to answer it in two ways, if that's okay. It's a great question. First of all, of course, by gesturing to the Book of Formation, which is considered perhaps the earliest Jewish mystical work, and Hechalot, I'm gesturing towards, some of your interests, right? To think about the history of Jewish mysticism and the way in which the mystical becomes part of the Jewish imagination. So I want to answer it in two ways. On the one hand, I want to say, Helen, the seeds for Jewish mysticism are already planted, are already very much part of anything from Ezekiel 1 to 4Q instruction. I'm going to refer to a few texts from the Dead Sea Scroll collection, the Songs of the Sabbath Sacrifice. We already see elements of mysticism that are growing, which is not new to me. I mean, this has been noticed by many scholars. But what I want to say is the growth of these texts that are particularly musical and particularly liturgical have this incredible afterlife. So on the one hand, I want to say by gesturing toward these collections that we already have a precedent here. On the other hand, I want to say that the growth and life of these traditions, which becomes much more extensive. Well, I don't know if it's more extensive. We have more evidence. We have more texts. We have more objects. We have more testimony, if you will, in all sorts of ways. We have more testimony in the context of synagogues, in the context of objects. And we see the way this is done. Here is where I want to kind of take a step back. Just like I said, Jeremiah is different from Psalms, and Psalms is different from the growth of the end of Exodus, which is a very, very complicated pluriform expression across all of the manuscript traditions are very complicated. Each rabbinic collection, and I think you would probably agree with me, we have to talk about vitality in different ways. Even if it's called oral Torah, it has fixity, and there are traditions, textual traditions, and they vary. But we also need to think about the way in which the traditions grow, not just the way in which they're incorporated. Like, for example, Tannaitic Midrash is incorporated into Bavli and Yerushalmi and beyond, but the way in which the Babylonian and the Palestinian Talmuds, but the way in which their iterations change over time. So this really requires a team of people. It requires a community of people that are thinking about pluriformity with different kinds of materials. And it's also the case that the musical or liturgical texts need to be handled not in the same way as the commentary traditions, although both the commentary traditions and the liturgical or the mystical liturgical traditions have a lot to contribute to that. And I won't do it alone, but what I'm hoping to do is, in a good way, open up Pandora's box. Okay, if that can be good. Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you very much.
It's also just one more footnote to Helen's work. So it's also an ongoing critique that we've talked about with respect to apocalyptic, right? Apocalyptic is a very complicated category, as I'm sure you've lectured about here. And it's part of a larger inspired or growing textual tradition. So I guess the third gesture is that these traditions continue. They continue into Christianity and into Judaism and ultimately into Islam as well. Thank you.
Sarah, can you speak loudly though so people online can hear?
Yeah, is that loud enough? Thank you, Hindy, for a wonderful lecture based on a wonderful book, and it's a real privilege to have you here. It's lovely to have you again. Thank you for all the things you said about humanities here. Hindy's a great champion for the humanities in general as well at Oxford. It has to be underlined. You've talked about resistance to rewriting our histories. That's very true, certainly for antiquity. The Hellenistic period, of course, has often been seen as a dead period in itself, when people, non-Jews, Greeks, were writing about the wonderful past of the classical world, but then they now lived in this pale imitation of the past. And clearly what you're writing about with Judaism will impact on the way we think about the Hellenistic period and Hellenistic history in general. So there should be a rewriting of Hellenistic history as well, a big contribution there from what you're saying. But I was just wondering if you see other examples of this kind of vitality and radical innovation in other cultures in the East at the same time, or is the Jewish contribution something that's different, that stands out in that world? And if so, why? Is there something particular about what's happening to Jews, particularly in Judea in this period, for the Dead Sea Scrolls and so on, that is influencing the way that they are responding to their environment? Sorry, that's a very long.
No, it's a very hard question, and there are at least two questions embedded. So I'm going to try to take each of them separately, if that's okay. And they're very serious questions. The second one is something that I can only do with you. You're really asking me to think across cultures, and I've spent a lot of time with the Syriologists, and I've started talking to Egyptologists about this. The main group I've spoken to are people in Assyriology and especially classicists. So I think that if you're talking about and I alluded to this a few times in my paper, if we're talking about, the growth of textual traditions, about, drawing lines so we can include, the catalepton, or, we can include the so-called marginal texts, or what to do with new fragments of Sappho, right? What to do with these traditions that grew or were said to have grown, associated with larger kind of figures that are larger than life. It's a very exciting moment in the field, and I don't have to mention to you all about Pompeii and Herculaneum and how exciting this is, right? This very exciting moment of finding new texts and or old texts, or old texts in different versions. So the conversation about pluriformity, to the classicists right now is very much bringing coals to Newcastle. I mean, 100%, right? This is exactly what they're doing, and I'm thinking with them and learning from them, and I'm getting a lot of freedom by working in this way, and they feel that they're getting a lot of kind of scripturalization, if you will, by working with me. So I think it's very productive. But you're asking something more than that, which is the vitality of which I speak something that's generalizable across cultures? And I want to say yes, but the historian in me says we have to be more careful, and we have to be careful, and we have to think about the way in which it grows in different ways. Relatedly, I've been working on philosophical concepts that might not be named, but are nevertheless present, and they grow and are very much part of this vital tradition, whether it's time, or whether it's nature, or whether it's inheritance, or higher and lower correspondences. And that's actually taken me into conversation with some sinologists who have also pointed out that some of the concepts that are absent, self-consciously absent, in Jewish texts or in ancient Chinese texts are also present implicitly. So how do we name developments, vital developments, or self-conscious accounts of engaging with concepts like creation and nature? And this might not be immediately obvious to how this is connected. I do connect some of this up in my book, but how this is connected. And the point is that as a vibrant and vital culture, it's also thinking about these really big issues, but possibly in pre-theoretical and non-scientific language, which doesn't mean that it's not also extraordinarily important for the history of Western and Eastern civilizations. So I've done some, and I could give you some other examples, but I haven't done enough. And it invites that kind of comparative conversation, which I think is urgent. And but both with respect to how humbled we need to be by engaging the other and think about that conversation, but it's also very important to understand how traditions that do and don't survive, how they think about their own writing and transmission. I'll quote classicist Brad Inwood, who's written about this a little bit. The Stoa did not survive, whereas the Platonists did. And why? And for him, he said, Moses survived and Plato survived because of their ability to create students and to transmit tradition, albeit in a transformed iteration. And I think that maybe, I don't feel like I've properly answered your second, much harder question. The first question is, but I'm thinking with you. And I heard also your questions in Oxford a few weeks ago about, Egypt and how to think about Egypt. This is, by the way, in our field, a very new area. That biblicists are now thinking with Egyptologists, and Bernd Schipper has a big ERC, my colleague in Berlin. And this is going to be important for the future, because we're coming to realize increasingly, not just for wisdom literature, but how important this conversation is for the shaping and thinking about the sapiential and the scientific. Of course, rewriting of history. We have to rewrite our history books. And I'm smiling because I'm not going to do it. I mean, I might. I am trying to rewrite history, but we need to rewrite history. And I'm looking at Sarah. We need to rewrite our histories. And we know that. It's convenient with new findings to kind of, push them into a corner and keep, the same pathway we've had. We have to embrace what we've come to know. We have to rewrite the story about iconic representation in synagogues, and artistic work. We need to rewrite the story about a pluriformity. It's not about fixity. There is no biblical canon in the Hellenistic period. There's a collection of definitive texts for community, but it's not exactly clear, the status of some of the texts that we conveniently call deuterocanonical after Luther. They're relevant. They sing in our own communities in antiquity, right? And they're present in many, many different contexts. And this is something we need to take responsibility for. And I want to take responsibility for it. I want to rewrite history in this way. And you'll see, I mean, if you read some of my earlier work and my more recent work, I'm very critical of some of the nomenclature that I used in my earlier articles, because I've come to realize it's not only anachronistic, but it kind of exhausts the field and it gives up on these findings, as opposed to learning what can the Thanksgiving hymns, the Hodayot, teach me? What can the scribal work of the Isaiah scroll that I showed you in some of the earlier slides? It can teach me so much about how ancient Jews are thinking about their own scriptural tradition. But that really changes the way we think about fixity and a monoform of a text. But what I don't want to leave you with this evening is that you don't have texts. We have texts. And even if I speak about pluriformity, it doesn't mean that they're so different that you don't recognize them. Some texts have very little variation. Some texts have radical diversion from one another across traditions, but we can still recognize it as Esther or as Jeremiah or as Isaiah. Yeah.
Let's go online, and Hannah's got a hand up for a question.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Hindy. Helen's actually already asked one of my questions, which was about the kind of viability of the use of scriptural vitality into kind of the rabbinic period, because my thesis looks at the Abrahamic tradition across scripture, the Second Temple period, and then into the rabbinic period. And actually, I'm using your work quite a lot within that, this idea of scriptural vitality. And you picked up on a few things within your talk about like kind of problematizing concepts like canonicity and like scriptural error and things. And I'm finding within my thesis, I'm finding myself kind of coming to heads with a lot of different categories. So kind of, rewritten Bible versus scripture, kind of trying to categorize like the Second Temple period. You talked about, classical versus Hellenistic versus Second Temple. So I kind of just wanted you to touch on kind of the use of these categories and whether we should get hung up on kind of putting things in individual boxes and things like that. Thank you.
So actually, when I realized what time it was and I wanted to make sure there was time for questions, I skipped a section on rewritten Bible. So I'm sorry for that. But there are two things I want to say, Hannah. One is that Jeremiah, those of you that know your scriptures well will know that Jeremiah typically has about 5 verbs. The first 2 are about, he's describing destruction and uprooting. And then they're verbs about rebuilding and replanting. And the reason I'm answering your question with that is because if I challenge categories, and I say this to my students, if we challenge categories, we don't just leave things ripped apart. We have to rebuild, and we have to think in a very productive way about what are we going to do with this new reality that we have pluriform texts and we can't trace a monoform. So this is a pedagogical move on my part. And the other thing you mentioned, Hannah, is, rewritten Bible is a great example, which maybe I'll just use that as my example. In my first book, I really wanted to do away with the term, and I couldn't do it because it was so embedded by figures, one of Sarah Peirce's teachers, by Vermesch, and also Philip Alexander and French scholar Perrault. They were right and wrong, right? Because to rewrite Bible, to call it rewritten Bible, is to presume that it's already fixed and it's just, it has to only be rewritten like commentary. And then it's also to presuppose Bible as a category, as canon. So I propose alternatives, and I proposed again new alternatives in the book. But sometimes I don't know if there are many people from many different disciplines here tonight. Sometimes I think I've come to realize we have to work with the categories that we have and then gloss them or work around them. Because to teach, a field a new language is very, very hard. So I'm trying to kind of, in sometimes provocative ways, sometimes less provocative ways, to say, this category is very problematic for the following reasons. We still might have to live and breathe with it, but when you use it, take ownership of it and understand why it's problematic. And this is really what I teach even first-year undergraduates, in Oxford. We still might use the term Old Testament in all of its problematic, but it's also a way of defining a collection in a religious tradition. So if we're going to use the terms like rewritten Bible, or we're going to use other terms, whether we call it early Judaism or late Judaism, let's think about what the implications are, and let's take responsibility ethically for, and here I think the right place to talk about this is in this institute. What are the larger implications for what we call the kind of texts that we work on when we work on Jewish texts, and how do we integrate them into the humanities in a responsible way? I mean, by calling on Sandy, this is also part of the answer to your question, Hannah. I'm constantly reading broadly, 80% of what I read does not go into my books because it doesn't fit, but I'm constantly trying to find the right match for the concept that I've identified. And so I interview a lot of people, to choose Foucault, I read everyone about authenticity and forgery and, Barthes' Death of the Author, but it just didn't help me, right? But Foucault and his inheritance of Nietzsche, who, by the way, he doesn't cite in What is an Author, which is very, very interesting, who's everywhere, who's on every page of that little piece, which I think most of us have probably read. I got it right then, right? I was able to connect then with the concept that I wanted. But it's also to move outside into new categories, we might have to consult people outside of our own field and to create bridges between, whether it's literature or philosophy, or whether it's medieval and ancient, in order to share what it is that we know, in order to think and rethink the categories that are so definitive of our disciplines.
I jump in, thank you so much for fascinating talk. On your point about reaching out to other fields, I was wondering about, I don't know if anybody did archaeology here, but I was wondering whether, or how far you think material culture and attention to material culture is a helpful way to think about the vitality.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
And I was fascinated by, I would love to see it again, the slide of the magic bowls.
Yeah.
Because they are amazing. And those are material objects, but they're also objects. I ask you how they used. If you think about how they might be used, they could have things in food or other objects. And in that sense, they conceal the bowls themselves.
Thanks.
If depending on how they might have been used, but those when they're full of things, you can't read the text and can't see the end. But as the imagine if something was being eaten out of it slowly, you see the text emerge, the picture emerges. Also, you can't read that in a way that you'd read a scroll. You're just thinking what the experience, what the reading process, the performativity of reading. They're in a circle, so you have to walk around it or turn it. So, could you say something?
Yeah, I'm going to say a little bit because I could say a lot more. But the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to name I'm going to name a few names.
Yeah.
So Gideon Bohak, who many years ago wrote Ancient Jewish Magic with Cambridge University Press, and he's continued to write about magic bowls quite a lot. And I'll name one of his prize students who now is a scholar in her own right. Her name is Abigail Manikin, and she's published one book and she's having another book come out on magic bowls, and they are extraordinary scholars, as well as the woman whose transcription I was showing you from Amulets, Rifki, Elitzur Lyman, and I can give you more of these references later. What's really exciting, and I didn't have time in the talk to talk about it, and I really don't talk about it in my work, and then I want to get back to your larger question about materiality, but I'm going to say maybe 3 things about these magic bowls. Unless I'm mistaken, and this is something we have to talk to both of them about, I don't think that these are written for eating, but they're also not written for reading. So they've also written about the fact that who they're writing for? Writing for the demons. I mean, like they're writing, and many of them are written in a way that it's impossible to read. They're extraordinary. They also have many images about They have, some of them are called pornographic images. The woman who did these images, her name is Nama Balajny, and she was also a student of Gideon Bohan. He's really created a field. He's an extraordinary colleague of mine. He's actually part of a larger project that we're launching now in the British Museum now in a few years from now. But one of the things we're doing is we have over 150 magic bowls of this sort just in the British Museum. We also have quite a few in the Ashmolean, and they're in other places, like they're in Paris, they're in Jerusalem. Embedded, by the way, the Deuteronomy 6, the Shema, the Hero Israel, the Lord our God, and the priestly blessing. These are two of the most common texts that are embedded, plus many, many other scriptural texts, but also like weird, I mean, Helen works on mysticism, but weird like utterances. Weird, I don't mean like strange sounds that are linked to communicating with, otherworldly. I said I would only say 2 or 3 things about it. One of the real reason why I put these on was because I want to stretch our imagination by what we mean by normative Judaism. So it's not just the Dead Sea Scrolls in addition to the biblical text. I want you to think about amulets. I want you to think about magic bowls. I want you to think about synagogal art, and it's not about, the rabbis versus, the common people. It's a much more complicated story. And you need you need all of these people linked. Well, don't tell anybody, but in the British Museum, we've been working on this for a while. It started in the Ashmolean, it's moved to the British Museum. It'll happen after the Bayeux tapestries, but linked to Scriptural Vitality is an exhibition which will be in the Sainsbury space on vitality of Judaism, which at this point it's called Resilience and Exile. Goes all the way through the medieval period, but it has magic bowls. We will have mosaics. We will have manuscripts, possibly the Sassoon Codex. We're hoping, but there'll be various different expressions. Let me go back to your archaeology question. In order to properly, so I hope I started to answer your question. I don't believe they're used for eating at all, and we have to go back to Abigail and to Giddy, but I think there are no traces of that. They're very creative. They're very creative integration of prayers that we know, Jewish prayers that we know that are integrated in these texts, and also weird signs, like weird magical signs that are embedded in these texts as well. Again, communicating with the other world. So archaeology. So I'm so excited because obviously I'm a text person. But in 2008, I got to know Rina Talgam, who's written Mosaics of Faith, which is a beautiful book. And she also just wrote a big monograph on the Magdala Stone. And we promised that we would work together. And I didn't even know what to do with the material. But since 2008, it's 20 years later, I'm not only working with Rina, but I'm working with Gideon Bohak, and I'm working with a number of archaeologists, 2 of whom are coming to join me in Oxford next term. So as a biblical scholar, or a scholar of Jewish interpretation, I've had to submit myself to archaeology, and it's transformed the way I think. But in conversation with archaeologists that also have to be willing to think about textuality, right? So not all archaeologists are willing to share toys, if you know what I mean. In my own experience, my training at Harvard, that was not really what the archaeologists, my own supervisor, this is being recorded, right? But I mean, but he said, they get their hands dirty, we read the texts, but the archaeologists had a similarly negative experience of us, that we weren't doing the serious work. And to separate that out as different disciplines was really the way I was brought up. And I've returned to these objects with such enthusiasm and such excitement, whether it's the Tanakh, cult stand, to understand the reading of Ezekiel 1, to understand its materiality, but not to reduce it to its materiality, right? Or the Magdala Stone. The signs of the Magdala Stone look a lot like the Sanctus, like the signs which will come to be included in the Kedusha or the Sanctus, because it has signs of not just the menorah, but other signs of the chariot, that are inscribed in this stone. So, because you asked the question, I'll give you one more example. I'll read Peleg Barkat, who's coming at the beginning of our 3rd term in Oxford. She's done a lot of work on Herodium. Herodium's an incredible example where, I mean, you can study the archaeology, but when I went with her, I saw Philo of Alexandria everywhere. Granted, and Sarah's like, that's a little early for Philo, but he is a little early for Philo, but what did he do at the end of his life? He surrounded himself, he created a world on the earth and a heaven and an earth. And we know from De Applicio Mundi, from On the Creation of the World and Philo. So we already see in the architecture and the thinking, Greek thinking that's being integrated into Jewish physical architectural space, not just practices of burial, but also modes of thinking. So I think to collaborate with, to participate, between archaeology and textuality, between materiality and textuality, is essential for us. I started because of manuscripts. I got very seduced, I think there's some medievalists here, by, material philology, new philology. And then I realized that it was another fetishization, just instead of the or text, it was, the object of the text, which became, and so I stepped away from it, but that's when I started moving towards materiality. So manuscripts are very, very important to me, and all of my students see some manuscripts. But then, I realized that I couldn't only look at manuscripts. And when we started looking at illuminated manuscripts, and then I started thinking about mosaics. So I'm just kind of walking you through my journey, and to try to understand cities and findings and architecture, not only idealized architecture, which is of course the kind of stuff that I was working on, paradigms and copies or temples and tabernacles, but also to see, lived life in cities. Lived religion requires, maybe this is the best way to end my very long answer to your question, and I apologize for that. I think lived religion exemplifies, and I'm borrowing this term from the previous Regis professor of Hebrew in Cambridge. Jeffrey Kahn talked about that with, and Sammy would know a lot about this, about, Neo-Aramaic and also Masoretic traditions, right? So you see it, you see the text come to life through the, marginalia, right? The commentary traditions. But we also have to go well beyond that, and we have to look at the objects and understand that this is also lived or exemplified through the people that lived and breathed in these contexts. So for Qumran, it's about spending time in the site, which was clearly this meditative therapeutic space which oversaw the Dead Sea, but also spending time in the caves and understanding the ways in which the materials were buried or cared for or protected, and which objects. Now, I hope you're thinking, because I'm certainly thinking of this, wow, there's so much silence here because there's so much we don't have. But what we do have we're all, we're fragments in some important sense. And as scholars of antiquity, we can only study fragmentary knowledge, but there are a lot of fragments. I mean, for Qumran, there are over 1,200 now that we've identified, but it's not just the metaphor of the fragmentation of knowledge, but we can use these fragments to put pieces together and to begin to understand, as Sarah was asking me, for a new history. And the normativity of magic or liturgy as part and parcel of life alongside temple life is part of this innovation. So we can't do it, I think, without the archaeologists. Thank you.
I think we've got time for maybe one more question. There is one in the chat. Yeah.
Do you want to read it?
Yeah.
What are the implications for your approach of slave agency in the production of transmission of texts? Enslaved scribes or readers. Yeah, I'm probably not the right person to answer that question. I'll say what I can, which is not a 5-minute answer. I might invite Sarah if she wants to help me a little bit. I guess what I would say is that we do study discourses about slaves that are embedded in scriptural and extra scriptural texts, and there are quite a lot of discussions about slaves. It's not something I've worked on very much, and in the text that I work on, there isn't extensive discussion of slaves in Jewish antiquity. Sarah, can you think of anything that I'm missing?
Well, with the Dead Sea Scrolls, I don't think you do have evidence that
No.
it's people other than free people who are doing the
Right.
copying.
Right.
And in the scribal tradition in Judaism, there's no sense that it's enslaved people who are employed to do that work. It's very privileged.
It's privileged, it's elite, it's priestly, yeah.
With Philo, I'm sure he did use slaves.
Yeah. I mean, I turn to Sarah, who's much more of a classicist, and I think I know that there's a lot of work done on slaves in the writing world. We don't have evidence about this in Jewish antiquity, right?
No, I don't think so.
Um,
Certainly slave ownership, not the use of slaves for writing. But you could imagine in Alexandria it would be quite normal.
No, but later, I'm even thinking, you know, I don't know if any of you went to the Silk Road exhibition at the British Museum, a couple of, I guess it's already a half a year now that it closed. And there was discussion about freeing slaves, about how much it cost to free slaves and Jewish slaves as well as Christian slaves and what went into that. But it wasn't linked particularly to this, a Jewish scribal culture. You know, the scribal culture, as Sarah just said, is very much connected to the elite. But yeah, I'm sorry, I'm sorry that I can't say more, although it's really a fascinating question.
Thank you. I think we're at time. Thank you again, Hindy, for a wonderful lecture and for such a generous and thoughtful response to questions as well. Please, thank you, Hindy.